Picture this. You're getting married to the love of your life, and instead of exchanging rings and saying romantic vows, you're required by law to drink each other's blood, submit to a public examination of your genitals, and prove your virginity using methods that would be considered torture by modern standards. Oh, and after all that, your wedding night is witnessed by a crowd of strangers who cheer every time the bed creaks. Welcome to medieval marriage, where "till death do us part" was less a romantic promise and more a legal contract that involved rituals so bizarre, so invasive, and so downright disturbing that they would result in criminal charges in today's world. These weren't quaint customs or optional traditions. These were legal requirements backed by church law and royal decree. Today I'm going to take you through 7 of the most shocking wedding rituals that were not only normal in medieval Europe, but actually required by law. And if you think modern weddings are stressful, wait until you hear about ceremonies where failure to perform correctly could result in annulment, public humiliation, or even execution. And if you're ready to discover just how dramatically our ideas about marriage have evolved, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because we have countless more historical revelations that will make you grateful for every aspect of modern civilization. Let's start with a ritual that literally involved bleeding for love. Let me introduce you to one of the most viscerally disturbing aspects of medieval marriage ceremonies: the legal requirement for couples to exchange bodily fluids as proof of their commitment. And when I say bodily fluids, I'm not talking about a symbolic kiss. I'm talking about drinking each other's blood, saliva, and sometimes urine. The blood bond ceremony was considered essential for creating a spiritual connection between husband and wife that transcended mere legal contract. Both parties would make small cuts on their palms or wrists and either drink directly from each other's wounds or mix their blood in a ceremonial cup that they shared. But blood was just the beginning. In many regions, couples were required to exchange saliva by chewing herbs together and swallowing the mixed result. This wasn't just about sharing spit. Specific herbs were chosen for their supposed magical properties, creating what was essentially a medieval love potion made from masticated plants and human saliva. The most disturbing variant involved urine exchange, particularly common in Germanic regions. Couples would drink each other's urine from ceremonial vessels based on the belief that consuming your partner's bodily waste created an unbreakable spiritual bond. The church actually provided special blessed cups for this purpose, turning what sounds like a bizarre fetish into a sacred sacrament. These rituals weren't optional or regional curiosities. They were legal requirements in many areas. Marriages that didn't include proper bodily fluid exchange could be annulled by church courts, and couples who refused to participate could face excommunication or banishment from their communities. The health consequences were exactly what you'd expect from an era without understanding of disease transmission. Many couples contracted infections, parasites, and communicable diseases during their own wedding ceremonies. It was literally sickening matrimony that often left newlyweds fighting for their lives before they could begin married life. If you thought modern wedding photographers were intrusive, wait until you hear about medieval consummation witnesses, legally appointed officials whose job was to observe and verify that the marriage had been properly sexually consummated. This wasn't voyeurism disguised as tradition. It was a legal requirement backed by church law. A marriage wasn't considered valid until it had been sexually consummated, and that consummation had to be witnessed by appointed representatives to prevent fraud, annulment claims, or questions about the legitimacy of future children. The witness ceremony typically involved the bride and groom being escorted to the marriage bed by a procession of church officials, family members, and legal representatives. The couple would be undressed by attendants, blessed by priests, and then left to consummate their marriage while witnesses waited outside the bedroom door. But here's where it gets truly invasive. The witnesses weren't just listening for sounds. They were required to observe physical evidence of consummation, including examining bed sheets for blood, proof of the bride's virginity, and conducting physical inspections of both parties after the act to verify that penetration had actually occurred. In noble families, the witness requirements were even more elaborate. Royal marriages might have dozens of witnesses, including foreign ambassadors, whose job was to report back to their own kingdoms about the validity of the union. The pressure on couples to perform sexually, while knowing they were being monitored, created psychological trauma that often lasted throughout their marriages. Some regions required witnesses to actually be present in the room during consummation, standing at the foot of the bed and providing commentary or encouragement. It was state-sanctioned sexual voyeurism that turned the most intimate moment of a couple's life into a public performance. Before a medieval bride could even reach the altar, she often had to submit to what amounted to medical sexual assault, disguised as religious ceremony. Mandatory virginity testing conducted by church-appointed matrons or physicians. These examinations weren't gentle medical procedures. They were invasive, painful inspections designed to verify that the bride was intact and therefore suitable for marriage. The bride would be stripped naked and examined by multiple women who would check for the presence of a hymen, look for signs of previous sexual activity, and sometimes conduct internal examinations using primitive instruments. The testing often involved techniques that would be classified as torture by modern standards. Some regions used what was called the needle test, where sharp instruments were inserted into the vagina to check for sensitivity and reaction. Others employed the water test, where liquids were forced into the vaginal cavity to check for abnormal openings that might indicate previous sexual activity. But the cruelty didn't stop with the bride. In some areas, grooms were also subject to genital examination to verify their capacity for consummation. Men had to prove their sexual functionality through physical inspection and sometimes demonstration of arousal under the watchful eyes of church officials. The psychological trauma of these examinations was compounded by their public nature. The results were often announced to wedding guests, with detailed descriptions of the bride's condition becoming part of the marriage contract. Women who failed virginity tests could be publicly shamed, rejected by their families, or even subjected to punishments ranging from whipping to exile. And if you're finding these medieval marriage horrors as shocking as I did when I first researched them, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We have so many more historical revelations that will make you grateful for every advance in human rights and dignity. The most heartbreaking aspect was that these tests were scientifically meaningless. Medieval understanding of female anatomy was so primitive that many signs of lost virginity were actually normal variations in human physiology. Countless innocent women were condemned based on medical ignorance, masquerading as moral authority. When disputes arose over who had the right to marry a particular woman, medieval law offered a solution that sounds like something from a fantasy novel: trial by combat, where men literally fought to the death for marriage rights. These weren't romantic duels between rival suitors. They were legal proceedings backed by church and state, based on the belief that God would ensure victory for whoever had the rightful claim. The woman in question had no say in the matter. She was essentially a prize to be won through violence. The combat trials followed elaborate rules that varied by region, but generally involved armed combat with swords, maces, or other medieval weapons. The fight continued until one participant was dead, seriously injured, or surrendered. The winner gained not just marriage rights, but often the woman's property, inheritance, and complete legal control over her life. What made these trials particularly disturbing was that they could be triggered by almost any marriage dispute. If a woman was promised to one man but preferred another, trial by combat. If a father wanted to change his mind about a marriage arrangement, trial by combat. If someone claimed a previous marriage contract existed, trial by combat. The women involved were forced to watch men potentially die for the privilege of marrying them. Many developed severe psychological trauma from witnessing violence committed supposedly in their honor. Some records show women attempting suicide rather than marry the winner of a particularly brutal combat trial. The legal framework supporting these trials was so elaborate that there were professional marriage champions, men who specialized in fighting trial by combat for marriage rights and could be hired by families or suitors who weren't skilled fighters themselves. It was mercenary violence in service of matrimonial law. Medieval society was obsessed with ensuring that marriages would produce legitimate heirs, leading to some of the most humiliating and invasive fertility testing rituals imaginable. Couples weren't just expected to consummate their marriage, they had to prove their reproductive capability through public demonstrations. These fertility tests involved elaborate ceremonies where the bride and groom had to demonstrate their sexual knowledge and capability in front of appointed church officials. The bride might be required to explain her understanding of reproduction, describe menstrual cycles, or even demonstrate knowledge of sexual positions considered most likely to result in conception. But the groom's testing was even more invasive. Men were sometimes required to achieve and maintain arousal while being observed by church officials, proving their capability for successful intercourse. This might involve partial nudity, manual stimulation, or even demonstration of ejaculation as proof of fertility. Some regions required couples to spend their wedding night in specially constructed fertility chambers, equipped with viewing slots, where officials could monitor their sexual activity. The goal was to ensure that proper reproductive techniques were being employed and that both parties were capable of fulfilling their procreative duties. The most bizarre fertility rituals involved breeding inspections, where couples were examined like livestock. Church officials would assess physical attributes considered important for reproduction: the width of the woman's hips, the size of the man's genitals, and even factors like breast development and body hair patterns that were thought to indicate reproductive health. These inspections often included forced nudity in semi-public settings, with multiple officials conducting examinations that would constitute sexual assault by any modern standard. The psychological damage inflicted on couples forced to undergo these humiliating procedures often poisoned their marriages from the very beginning. Medieval marriage wasn't just about joining two people, it was about transferring property, and some regions required physical demonstrations of male dominance to make these transfers legally valid. These rituals transformed marriage ceremonies into displays of ownership that would be recognized as domestic violence today. The submission ceremony typically involved the groom physically overpowering the bride in front of witnesses to demonstrate his right to control her body and property. This might involve wrestling, carrying her against her will, or forcing her into positions that symbolized sexual submission. In some areas, the groom was required to literally strike the bride during the ceremony, a symbolic blow that established his legal right to use physical force in the marriage. These weren't gentle taps. They were often hard enough to leave bruises that served as visible proof that the dominance ritual had been properly performed. The most disturbing variant involved claiming strikes, where the groom had to hit or restrain the bride while reciting specific legal formulas that transferred ownership of her property to him. It was domestic violence disguised as legal ceremony, creating marriages that began with ritualized abuse. Women who resisted these domination rituals could have their marriages declared invalid, leaving them without legal protection or financial support. The choice was submit to ritualized assault during the wedding or face a lifetime of destitution and social ostracism. These rituals weren't just symbolic. They established legal precedents for ongoing domestic violence throughout the marriage. A man who had publicly demonstrated his right to strike his wife during the wedding ceremony could cite that precedent if later accused of domestic abuse. The most macabre of all medieval marriage rituals involved couples making literal death pacts as part of their wedding vows, legally binding agreements that required the surviving spouse to die within a specific time after their partner's death. These eternal marriage ceremonies included detailed planning for joint suicide, with couples required to specify exactly how they would kill themselves if widowed. The most common methods were poison, stabbing, or hanging, with the chosen method often incorporated into the wedding ceremony itself. The death pact ritual typically involved the couple sharing poison that had been blessed by church officials, but diluted to non-lethal levels during the ceremony. This practice death was supposed to prepare them for the real thing and demonstrate their commitment to eternal union. But these weren't just symbolic gestures. They were legally enforceable contracts. Surviving spouses who failed to follow through on their death pacts could face legal consequences, including loss of inheritance, excommunication, or even execution for breach of sacred contract. Church records show that many of these death pacts were actually enforced. Widows and widowers were sometimes held in church custody until they fulfilled their obligation to die, with some being provided with the means of suicide and others being executed if they refused to kill themselves voluntarily. The psychological impact of entering marriage with a pre-planned suicide pact created relationships poisoned by the constant awareness of orchestrated death. Some couples became obsessed with dying together, leading to murder-suicides where one spouse killed the other, and then themselves rather than risk being separated by natural death. The legacy of matrimonial horror. So there you have it. 7 medieval marriage rituals so bizarre and disturbing that they sound like torture techniques disguised as wedding traditions. These weren't aberrations or extreme examples. They were normal legal requirements that millions of couples endured as the price of marriage in medieval society. The brutal reality is that these rituals reflect a view of marriage that had nothing to do with love, partnership, or mutual respect. Medieval marriage was about property transfer, social control, and establishing legal ownership of women's bodies and lives. The bizarre and invasive rituals weren't bugs in the system. They were features designed to enforce a social order based on domination and submission. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is how these practices were sanctified by religious authority and enforced by legal systems that treated women as property and marriage as a transaction rather than a relationship between equals. Every invasive examination, every public humiliation, every act of ritualized violence was blessed by church officials and backed by state power. These medieval marriage horrors remind us that the romantic ideals we associate with weddings today, consent, privacy, mutual respect, and personal choice, are relatively recent innovations in human history. For most of recorded history, marriage was a form of legalized oppression that began with ceremonies designed to establish and celebrate male dominance. Now, if you've made it this far with me through this exploration of matrimonial nightmares, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment and let us know what corner of the globe you're calling home, because it's fascinating to see how these historical horror stories reach people everywhere who can appreciate how far we've come. And if you're hungry for more stories that will make you grateful for every advance in human rights and dignity, you know what to do. Subscribe to our channel. Trust me, we have historical revelations that will make you appreciate everything from basic privacy rights to the simple concept of consent. Until next time, remember, the next time you complain about modern wedding planning stress, at least you don't have to drink your partner's blood or prove your virginity to a panel of church officials. Sometimes progress is measured in the horrors we've left behind,